Hit the wrong record. There we go. We're
Okay,
live.
we're live. Welcome, everybody, to the 11th episode of the second season of History Matters, and so does coffee, and the 49th episode. We're moving up towards the year mark.
We
Really
are. We're getting close.
shocking. Very briefly, what we're going to be talking about. Actually, first, let me say I apologize for coming up with the topic so late, but I had a wacky week. And so it only came in online for you to see it yesterday evening. But what I wanted to talk about, I think the title that I sent Matt was it was about processing, dealing with crisis and change, or processing crisis.
Processing the now, I believe is what.
Processing the now, dealing with crisis and change, which I thought of because of one of the events I did this last week, which basically kind of asked me that question and really got me thinking. So we're going to be talking about how we're thinking about just the sort of the current moment, and I'll be talking as a historian, as an American, and as a citizen, and kind of reflecting in different ways on how at least I would bet many of you are thinking about the present. And then I really want to open this up because I really want this to be a conversation, particularly this week, because we're all in this together. So, but I will stop there for a moment because my partner in crime, Matt, has things he needs to say about the rules of the game.
Uh, 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 yeah, well, it should be. It's going to be a fun day. We're going to enjoy this. Um, Welcome everybody to History Matters and So Does Coffee. Um, Rules of the game are as follows, which are standard. If this is your first time, these will be new to you. But of course, if you are one of our regulars, this will be old hat, and you'll be waiting to hear me say many of my catchphrases, including "If you like us here" at the National Council for History Education. Rules of the game are as follows. We do have our chat open for folks to comment. We encourage you to use that to talk, to engage in our community. We have a wonderful community here. And unfortunately, we don't get to see you, but we can get to know you through the chat. So please use that, just as always, to keep it germane to the conversation and family friendly. If you do have questions for Joanne, or you want to engage in questions and as part of the conversation here today, please make sure to put those in the Q&A section. Chat tends to move pretty quick, especially when we get going. So we ask that you put it in the Q&A so we can keep track of who's asked what, and make sure to get as many of your questions as possible. And as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please visit us on the web. Our web address is www.ncheteach.org, and we have a wide variety of opportunities for you. A couple things of note: we do have online courses now available, a couple of them, so you can try those out if you're interested in that. You can link to it from our website, or you can go right to learning.nche.net, and you'll be able to access some of the online courses. But most importantly, we do have our national conference coming up, our online conference coming up in a couple weeks. We have some great opportunities for keynote speakers, for virtual field trips, for great sessions. And of course, how can we not mention on April 8th, which will be our 365th day on this show. Joanne and I will be doing History Matters and So Do Cocktails at 8:30 p.m. It's a fundraiser for the NCHE. So please go to our website and you can sign up for any and all of that. The fee structures. Somebody asked about how all the prices. You can find all that information there. You can register right there, and it should be a great time. We're really looking forward to that evening. And yeah, so Joanne and I are, as I say every week, we are feverishly checking our historical cookbooks for the perfect libation for the evening.
We might have to name it, Matt.
Yes, we will have to.
We might have to come up with like our name for the cocktail.
That's true.
We might have to like dub it like the History Matters cocktail. I don't know. I'm like talking off the top of my head here, but I'm thinking.
Sounds like a plan. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to Joanne to get started, and thank you everybody for being here, and we will have a great day today.
Okay, excellent. Hello to everybody. I saw just before Catherine mentioned something about putting together a panel or associated, let me put it this way, associated today's topic with the idea of trauma, which is a good link, although I mention this only because I am in no way a trauma specialist. But I guess that is kind of associated with what we're talking about today, although I mean it in a broader and I suppose in some ways um, not as deep a way, but really more about to talk about how we have been and are thinking about the times that we're in. And as I mentioned at the outset, the reason I thought of this was I did an event, I guess on Tuesday, with a group that's associated with Congress that very much wanted just to talk about the events of January 6th with people that had some perspective on how to process it and how to think about it. And when I was thinking about that and preparing for that, I ended up, someone I saw on the chat said only 3 Joanne brains today. Yeah, so I ended up thinking with American brain and citizen brain and historian brain, I ended up thinking about it in 3 ways. So I ended up thinking about it as an American on sort of a gut level as far as processing these times. I thought about it obviously as a historian, and then I thought about it as a citizen. And so that's what I want to do this morning. I want to talk a little bit about our times. I'll probably start out with January 6th only because it's kind of a launching pad, but I want to talk in all 3 voices about ways to think about the present, or ways that are useful to think about the present, or maybe even ways that are not useful to think about the present. And as I said a moment ago, then I really want to open it up because I think this is the kind of discussion that is a worthwhile discussion, because we are all and have all been in this together. We all have our different brains with which we're processing this, and this seemed to me like this could be a really good conversation. Okay, so let me launch this and give you a sense of where I'm going, and I'm going to start out speaking as with my American brain, speaking as an American, because the first thing that I thought for that event on Tuesday was my immediate reaction to the events of January 6th, which were really kind of on a fundamental level. I don't want to say stronger than I imagined, but they punched me in a way that I didn't expect to get punched. And part of that had to do with something I've talked about before here on History Matters, which is the Capitol building itself and the meaning of the Capitol building, and that it's kind of a monument to the American process of government and to democratic representation. And it has all of the great artwork and all of the statuary and things in it because they're supposed to inspire you to think about some of the higher ideals and achievements of the nation in its history. So it's meant to grab you on an emotional level in a way. And I think for that reason, on January 6th, watching that attack unfold, certainly, I'm sure many of us, if not most of us, felt a kind of emotional response to that. What interested me about that was, in the case of my response, it touched me in a way that I don't know if I've quite been touched before. And I can think of other moments in American history where I might have had the same response. But what I found was this sort of deep nested sense of outrage, like beyond, not something that I could sit and write. And obviously right now I'm having a hard time finding the words, but the sort of profound depth of my emotional response to what was happening that was like so powerful that I didn't know what to do with my anger. And that anger was not just like, hey, you're not allowed to do that. That was anger about the representative nature of what was going on and what it meant, and certainly how I understood it, what it meant to me. So that even now I find that I always find that, I guess this is also historian brain, I always find it interesting when I experience a modern event and it inspires feelings in me that I know others have felt about other events in the past, or experience an event that others have felt in the past, and I can understand in a different way what the people in that moment felt like when they experienced it. So in this case, that surprised me. But the positive, if there's a positive sort of connection to that idea, is part of the pain of that was my feeling outraged at an insult to what I always call the we, right? I talk about this all the time. I say this all the time to my friend Peter Onuf when we're talking about current events, and I'm like, the we is damaged. Like our we is weak. We need a stronger we, and he's now like says, as you always say, Joanne, the we. But part of my emotional response was because that was an attack not on me, on we, right? That was an attack on us, and so in a sense, that my awareness of that kind of reinforced that idea and that bond. And we have also talked at various points in the past on that problem right now, that our sort of sense of ourselves as a we, as a society, as a nation is highly fractured at the moment in a lot of ways. I think the most dramatic way in which that's apparent is people refusing to wear masks, because if you were actually thinking about others, you would not hesitate. But if you're thinking about your own freedoms, then that's where you get, if that's how you feel. So at any rate, so the sort of guttural response I had to that, which I do think is not just related to January 6th, but has to do with a lot of the things that were going on over the course of the last few years, and sort of anticipatory guttural responses now, right? That I may not expect every minute of every day for some shocking thing to happen, but I'm very aware of what's happening around me, and I am prepared to have a strong response, right? And so I think and I'm guessing many of you, are living on a different level of alert than you might have in the past, and a different level of emotional engagement than you might have been in the past, and that we're connected to what's going on in a different way, which I'm going to end by pointing out how there is a positive side to that. But I think we are living in a different headspace right now, and I don't know. I say right now, I don't know if or how it will change, but the place we are now and the way that we think about the nation, the country, its politics, ourselves, the future, we're at a moment where there's a lot of processing going on. So as an American, that was the point I wanted to make, is that we're all being touched really deeply and profoundly in ways that I'm guessing many of you, like me, haven't quite felt that before. And it's not a bad reminder to have, but it's not comforting either, right? So in one way or another, I think we're on less high alert than we have been, but still, I think that's worth acknowledging, and how we are or aren't processing what's going on around us. Speaking as a historian, obviously, when I spoke on Tuesday, one of the things I mentioned was watching the events of January 6th, and just thinking about the deep roots of what we were seeing, right? And some of them are obvious, right? That was, on one level, it was white supremacism asserting its power, right? And it was white supremacism in the way that these people were, in some cases, enabled to get along and go along and do what they were doing. And we're still finding out the facts of that matter. So I won't speak absolutely about who or how they were enabling things, but still, what we saw was people who were upset about the democratic process, who didn't believe in it, who wanted to shut it down, and in particular, shut down the essence of our democracy, which is our votes, right? To sort of stop that process because they didn't like it. And it was a largely white group of people who were asserting their voice and their dominance, who felt entitled to be dominant in that way, and who were using intimidation and then ultimately violence to hang on to power. And that's a larger dynamic that I wanted to mention here. And I've written about it. I guess I wrote about it in the New York Times, I don't know how many weeks ago now. My point in the New York Times, and the point I'm referring to here, is if you've been in power for a long time, if you feel entitled to that power, if you feel threatened that that power might be taken away, and if you have a sense that the demographics of the nation are shifting in a way that it really might not come back once it goes, that's a moment when you are going to do what it takes to maintain power, even if it's hanging on by your fingernails. And that includes violence and intimidation. And we've seen that before. We've seen it throughout American history. And that's some of what we saw now. When I wrote the New York Times article, I was talking about the 1850s because that's what slaveholders were doing in Congress. They had been in control of the national government in one way or another for most of the history of the country, partly because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. They had a number advantage, an advantage of numbers in Congress. And then because they were so readily willing to be violent and knew that Northerners had more issues with man-to-man violence, they had that cultural advantage as well. So they assumed that they were entitled to that and that that's the way things should continue. And when it became obvious that things might not continue in precisely the same way and they felt threatened, they upped the violence. They began more aggressively to try to deploy violence to silence or intimidate people who threatened their continued dominance in national politics and in the nation. So that's a dynamic that makes sense. And in that sense, what's going on now certainly is of interest to me because it immediately connected me to some of the things that I just wrote about. Very, very similar in their dynamics, but obviously, again, connected to such deep roots in American history about the role of violence in politics, about the fundamental nature of voting rights and its connection with democracy, and ways in which voting rights have been attacked by people who want to claim or keep power, and they attack voting rights to prevent people from getting to their power, right? It's a power play is what it is. So attacks on voting rights have deep, deep roots. Extreme polarization, when one group of Americans turns on another group of Americans and says, well, you're not American. You're, fill out right now everyone has their favorite ism, right? You're a communist, socialist, whatever the ist is, right? That people say you're not American, but I am. Again, just like violence in politics, just like people who have power don't want to lose it using violence. Again, think of the civil rights era too as another moment when this is happening. We have this pattern, we reenact this pattern again and again and again. And although what happened on January 6th looked shocking to see because of where it took place, on a deeper level, at a more symbolic level, it was a reenactment of what we've done in one way or another throughout our history. And as that was unfolding, and I guess not in the conversations not long afterwards, a word that I heard again and again and again pronounced in the press and by the media and by pundits was unprecedented. Like, this is unprecedented. And I was bothered by that because there were some aspects of it that are unprecedented. A president sort of goading people or encouraging people to do that, that's kind of shocking. The way in which it was a mass attack on the US Capitol, not a small group, but really a mass attack on the US Capitol, there were aspects of it that were unprecedented. But as far as an event when white power holders were trying to block out the desire of a broader group of voters who were not all white, that's not new. That's so many aspects of it were not new. And I think that got lost in the way that we processed that moment. And I think still we lose track of the deeper meaning of things that we see. So, now what we're seeing is a lot of attempts to pull in, to reduce voting rights, to keep certain people away from voting, or making it so hard to vote that people who might vote and might not vote Republican are going to have a harder time getting to vote, getting to the polling place, having their vote count, closing the window of when people can vote. And I think people are noticing that. They might not be plugging into the fact that that strategy has such a deep background in American history that, again, what we're seeing isn't just born of now. It's what we do in this country, how we violate democracy, or how some people violate democracy when they want to hang on to power no matter what, right? So it's a broader pattern. It says a lot about who we are, and those moments in the past can speak to us about the present. So, if you think about the argument that's sort of been bubbling beneath the surface in the last year or two about how do we think about American history, and some people have been arguing we just should focus on the heroes, the good stories, and the problem with that is totally part of what I'm talking about here, which is if you do that, If you only focus on the heroes and the happy moments and you cut away things that in your mind make America look less than stellar, you are erasing any hope we have to understand precisely where we are now. You're just erasing it. And part of the reason we are where we are now is because we haven't dealt with some aspects of this. So, I think as a historian, in so many ways, the fact that we need to process what's going on now is important. How we do it is important. And doing that as a group in different ways, in different groups, is important too. And I don't know how widespread that thought is, but deep roots mean potentially profound impacts in the future. And I think we need to think about that. The last way before I open things up that I want to talk about sort of processing the here and now has to do with being a citizen. And, on January 6th, that struck me because after everything that we saw, they still that evening got together and counted the votes. So the process went on. And that was important. And I think the people who were there at the time, the members of Congress who were there at the time, understood that. It's part of why they were doing it, the process matters, the vote counting matters, and that what happened that day was not going to shut the process down. And one of the things I find I have been thinking about a lot actually in recent years, and that I continue to think about today, is process. Because the founders, in putting the Constitution into motion, they of course were building a framework for a government. They were building structures of government, and that was vital. And the fact that they had it ratified as they did, they were engaging everyone in agreeing to that kind of political contract. But in a sense, I think the most important thing that they felt they were doing was setting processes, shared processes on paper that the nation could use to hold together as a nation and to resort to when things went wrong. And I think I've mentioned this before when talking about the election of 1800. Maybe I have, maybe I haven't. At this point, it's been almost a whole year, so who knows? But Jefferson, after the election of 1800, which I know I've talked about how fraught it was, how people in two states were arming in case they needed to seize the government away from Federalists who in their mind were usurping it. How Jefferson, I mentioned a Jefferson letter in which he tells someone else how we, the Republicans, let it be known to the Federalists that if they took the wrong move, that there would be action taken, which again was a sort of surprisingly threatening kind of a letter from Thomas Jefferson. He's asked, well, what if things had gone worse? Like, what if it hadn't resolved? And Jefferson says, well, we would have had to tweak things, the system, the process. Maybe we would have had another constitutional convention and sort of, I think as he puts it, wound things up again. We would have tweaked the process and then gone right back to what we were doing because the process is there. And that's what we should resort to at moments of crisis. And in different moments at different times, we've seen that, right? So at some moments of crisis, it can be an election that is a part of the process that pulls people out. In 1800, after the election of 1800, Federalists who hated Jefferson actually did step back to see what would happen. They ended up hating Thomas Jefferson again, but still, the process happened, and there was a moment of people allowing that. Supreme Court cases, again, represent process and action. You don't always like the case, but it represents an action that you have to reckon with once it's been taken. So the importance of process, of our joint agreement on the process as represented in the Constitution, why it matters when that process is really aggressively violated. Newbie's getting very upset at this discussion of process. He's flapping all over the cage. But the fact that matters and how profoundly it matters, we've gotten a lesson in that over recent years. And it matters a lot, among other things, because I do think we are, as Americans, remarkably uninformed about the process. We are remarkably uninformed about democracy. And that's been apparent too in the recent past and the not so recent past. One of the, again, trying to find the positive spin here, one of the positive aspects of recent events has been people thinking more about democracy, people being more engaged with politics and the political process, people thinking about the fundamental right to vote and that can be taken away, people thinking about their right to protest and having that be endangered, people being encouraged to protest more, young people being engaged in politics in a way that they potentially haven't been before, and generally speaking, people understanding in a, to them, probably a new way that a democratic government and our government doesn't go in and of itself, that it requires us to watch it, to prop it up, to support it, and to protect it. And we've been watching what happens when we do or don't do that in recent years. So, speaking as a citizen, one of the ways in which I'm processing this moment is thinking again and again and again about the process and how it's working or isn't working, what that means, how important that is, and then thinking again and again, I guess, as a citizen slash teacher, about what I can do to inform people more about some of these basic things about democracy. One of the ironies to me that I think about sometimes in recent years is, I guess I'm not anti-Jefferson, but as a Hamiltonian, I'm not normally like cheering for anyone in particular, but Jefferson, maybe, Hamilton had attitude to Jefferson, so I at least look at him warily. But Jefferson said many times that Americans needed at least a minimal amount of education. All white Americans, all white male Americans needed a minimal amount of education because they needed to be able to recognize threats to the republic. And the only way they would understand that was if they understood the republic and how it ran and what it was and the history of other republics and other nations being destroyed. So they needed education as a way to be alert to threats. And I find myself going back to that thought now and in recent years, again and again and again and again, that, you can see on a level how that's true. You can see if people fundamentally don't understand what democracy is or why it's good or why we should protect it or why it matters. You can see what happens. It's easy to smack away pieces of it. And once they're smacked away, it's harder to put them back. So I think that as a citizen, there are positive aspects of what's been going on because we are all in a way more invested. It's interesting. I mean, now we have a new administration. We should be watching that as carefully as we watched the last one, just to see what's happening, to be aware of what's happening, to support it if we want to support it, to watch for things that we're not sure about, not to step back at this moment and say, well, everything's better. We can now relax and turn away. We should never turn away. We should never turn away. We should always be alert and watching what's happening in government, local government, national government, because the fact of the matter is we are the people it's supposed to serve. They are public servants of us. And so ideally, if one of the ways, the lessons of processing now in the recent past is that people learn that you don't look away from government, you always remain alert and always are thinking about the implications of what's happening, that would be a powerful lesson indeed. Now, the one last thing I'll mention here, because we just really don't know what's going to happen with it, but that as a citizen, I think about a lot too, and as a historian, and as an American, and I've tweeted about it a lot, and that's accountability, right? Because if you talk about in American democracy, what are some of the big tenets? What are some of the big issues that make democracy? Voting rights are one, a free press is one, and the accountability of people who we give power to in how they deploy that power, their accountability to us for what they do is another major one. And I think, I'm watching to see what unfolds and what happens now versus what happened then, and how we continue to process some of the things that happened semi recently. We're still processing, and I don't know the outcome of that. No, I don't think anyone knows what the outcome is going to be, but I think that matters a lot because, as with voting rights, and as with protest, as with all of these things, holding people accountable or letting things slide will have a fundamental impact on democracy. So I guess that's another argument for staying alert, to watch what happens, and then knowing that we have the right to voice our thoughts about what's happening and to come forward when we see things that are unjust and undemocratic, to say something. And I think more and more people did that in recent years in a way that I found encouraging, just the Black Lives Matter movement generally, and the fact that there were large groups of people of all kinds coming together to voice their feelings about that. That was encouraging, right? So anyway, I'm gonna pause because I do want to open this up as a discussion. But that's kind of where I ended up on Tuesday thinking about processing this moment. Is there are aspects of it that I find encouraging. There are aspects of it that I find worrying, and that continue to be disturbing. There are aspects of it that are just exhausting. I haven't really talked about that, but I know that a lot of you who are here in this community this morning are as exhausted with so much of this as I am, right? It's just exhausting to be in a state of awareness that way, and to really have a sense that, the ground could shift in a dramatic way at any time. Right now, the ground feels a little bit more stable, but that doesn't mean, we're done and things are happy. I'm going to please everyone by saying contingency, right? We don't know what's going to happen. And we need to be aware of that because what just happened was dangerous indeed. So how we process it and the fact that we are processing it matters. And the worst thing in the world would be for people to step back and just say, well, that's done, and move on, because that just leaves a big gaping hole of vulnerability that we don't want to be there. Okay, I'm going to stop with that. I'm going to welcome my partner in crime back. That was my 2 cents for the day. And I don't have chat open, but I immediately thought Carolee's going to tell me about the mug. Okay. So Carolee, you don't even need to say anything anymore. I'm just like, the mug, Carolee's going to, and you did, see? Okay, so because this discussion was kind of about us processing things that are not necessarily pleasant, but doing them for reasons that serve us and everyone, it's my be good to yourself mug.
Excellent. Well done.
It's my be aware, and it has actually a variety of ways in which you could be good to yourself, most of them having to do with ways that we think. So this is my thematic mug for the morning, the best that I could do. I actually love this mug.
It's
I
a
bought
great
it when
mug.
I was wow, I won't go into detail. Let's just say I was on a trip with a former boyfriend and feeling very sad, and I bought myself this mug. So whenever I see it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the mug I bought on the trip. Anyway, I will stop there. And Matt now.
Yeah, I've moved so people can see it. This is
for those if there are folks here who are new, I have a thematically associated mug every week, and Matt comes up with a background that has something to do with what we're talking about. And this is a tough one.
This is going to be one where you're like, oh, seriously?
Okay, wait, I gotta move.
So I see no guesses. No. Somebody said it's familiar, but it's not. Okay, so today's theme is called processing the now. And so I needed something to reflect the about processing. So I went therapy. This picture is from season 1, episode 3 of The Sopranos. This is Melfi's waiting room. So if you remember the episode, Tony walks into Melfi's office, and see, I'm getting some OGs.
Yeah.
Tony walks into Melfi's office and goes off about the trick painting in her waiting room, and this is the painting from it. So
wow.
I wanted to get one of Melfi's office, but I couldn't find a picture of Melfi's office without them both there,
which would have given it away. Okay, so the office is brilliant. This I did not remember.
Only because I restarted the series. Is this like I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that episode.
And for those of you who haven't watched The Sopranos, this is the office of the lead character, Tony Soprano, the mobster's therapist.
Yes.
So processing. This is processing.
Yeah. So this is all about processing today, and I went a long way for this one. This is sort of one of those. Anyway, this is what happens after my alma mater implodes in a tournament they should be in the Final Four.
I think that's creative thinking. I never would have guessed it, but now that I know what it is, it's
now that you know what it is, you're like, oh yeah, okay. All right.
Okay, so I want to open things up because I want to see. I just saw someone say democracy PTSD. Well, yeah, and I think oh, missed the mug. Who missed
But
the mug?
it's
Elizabeth.
actually, yeah. So go ahead and do the mug again.
Elizabeth said she missed the mug. I'm just showing Elizabeth the mug. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But I think that maybe that's a good place to this, P, democracy PTSD in some ways, right? What you're talking about is when you're putting on these different brains, um, that's what this is about, right? This is about processing. Um, it is processing a sort of a PTSD for folks who pay close attention to government and to what's been going on in our democracy, historically and today. So it's maybe that's not such a bad way to frame it, right?
No, and I mean, if part of what I was saying was we need to be alert,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a certain way, that's saying a little bit of over awareness is a good thing, which is not something I'm comfortable saying because I think I've been supremely anxious, and anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that I have real sleeping issues now. Like I lie awake in bed. During the last presidency, I was awake a lot. I now sleep more, but still, um, I don't know. I have a very mixed feeling about this. Although I see now, uh, Dr. Nancy Walker, definitely democracy PTSD. That's right. If you're in Washington, well, right. Okay. So
Yeah.
someone just brought up September 11th, but that was different. It's interesting. I feel like that was different, although so many of the same things were touched on with that attack. Um, that's an interesting comparison to make. I mean, a lot of people, I think, particularly people who were in the places where it happened, um, had a guttural physical reaction to that for a really long time. Um, but this is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's less concrete in some ways. It really, I mean, it asks some pretty fundamental questions about democracy and what it is and how we understand it and how we relate to it that probably a lot of people haven't thought of before. I mean, I think even I, at some point in the past, just took it for granted. Democracy is good. It works. It goes of itself. That's how America is. Democracy always wins. And, part of the democracy PTSD that we've had recently is those things aren't true, right? It doesn't always win.
Right.
People won't always see that it's good. Um,
And I think my point also is that so much has happened since, let's say, August of 2016, that and some of it's traumatic, some of it's just busy, some of it's, I mean, for historians especially, when you look at sort of how the structures that we have come to know and trust and were became malleable, right? Like that is part of that processing, right? Like it's part of that, of deconstructing like what happened and why did it happen, that it makes us feel, uncomfortable, maybe. I don't know.
I don't know. And I mean, a lot of you who are watching are teachers, right? And that gives us the extra added bonus
Yeah.
of what do you do? What do you do for your students? What do you do with your students? I want my students to understand what just happened. I want them to see the threat in what happened. I don't want to traumatize them while doing that. And I've probably said this before, I've never really been a person who brought the present into my history classes. Not that they didn't relate, but I pretty much stayed in the past. And this last semester, I think I've mentioned this before, at the end of the last 10 or 15 minutes of my seminars were a moment that was apart from the rest of the class where they could relate what we just talked about to the present.
Hmm.
And we were talking about the press and voting and these fundamental things. How could you not, in a class talking about those things in the 1790s and early 19th century, then talk about what's happening now and how they relate? But it's it's a question, and I think we don't know yet how all of these events are really affecting students on all levels, right? We're beginning to see these stories about long-term impact, and we've already had stories about different students in different places with different economic possibilities being shaped by the limitations of teaching in the last year in different ways. But I think on a broader level, on an emotional level, we don't know what the sort of emotional and intellectual impact will be of these events. And, that gets us back to contingency. None of us are going to emerge from this exactly the same as we went in, which is a fact. But that has something to do with how we understand government and country, and that has something to do with how we understand our place in relation to them, and that has something to do with how we process who we are and where we are and when we are, right? That's just going to be different. I don't know how, but it's really clear. I don't know if it's that clear to you folks, but it sure seems clear to me. I'm not going to ever think about American politics in the same way. I'm not, after September 11th, I remember thinking, I'm never going to feel entirely safe in the United States again. And I had before, because I hadn't been thinking about that kind of immediate terrorist act to that capacity in that way. And suddenly I was like, oh, I think I was feeling safe in a way that I really didn't have a right to feel safe. I now feel like in some way or another, there's going to be a long lasting impact that I'm just never going to be able to think about certain things in the same way. And as I just suggested in my comments, I think some of that is good and some of that will be difficult. But I wonder what others are thinking.
Well, so there are the questions so far, and I don't know if you have it open in front of you, are
No.
Some really good ones here. But maybe why don't we dive into some historical questions?
Okay.
To start off with, maybe that will help us, because I want to come back to folks in the chat are talking about the city on a hill, which Sarah Vowell actually talked about last week when she was with us. And where that came from and everything. So I want to return to that, but let's start with the more historical line of questioning. And so Catherine asks, in many ways, on and after January 6th, it felt a bit like there are traitors to democracy, not necessarily the U.S., who had infiltrated Congress. Those are her words, not ours. I just be clear. Are there parallels in the 18th and 19th century Congress? Were there members trying to undermine legitimate elections or similarly harm democracy in your reading of the 18th and 19th century Congresses?
Well,
in other words, and maybe let me put it to you this way. What Catherine is pointing to, I think, is sort of a turning point for the kinds of trauma that we just got done discussing. Do we see those turning points elsewhere in history where trauma is democratic trauma, if you will, is sort of inflicted on the populace?
Well, to go back in a sense to the first version of that question about has there been a moment, even just in Congress, where it felt as though there were people who turned on the system in some way to inflict damage to promote themselves? Yeah, there's probably more than one. The one that I think of is the 1850s. And by the late 1850s, you had Southern members of Congress who were just waiting for the right moment to launch bloodshed in Congress to make a point. There are letters in which it's actually a governor, maybe, surprise, surprise, it might be a South Carolina governor. I think it was a South Carolina governor who wrote to the South Carolina delegation in Congress and said, and this is like 1859 or 58, and said something like, we need to make a really strong point now about what we're willing to stand for or not willing to stand for. And if I could, as governor, I'd provoke it here, but I can't do anything on the national stage to provoke bloodshed and warfare and an attack of some kind. You guys are in Congress. You can do that. You can start this going. And if you do that, then the message will be clear, right? So that's a pretty explicit plan to stage an attack on the government in some way. And interestingly, I found at one point a letter from a South Carolina congressman, actually, no, from his wife, letters to and from wives are extremely revealing and usually wonderful to get a hold of. And in this case, I stumbled across a letter from this guy's wife, and she was writing, I think, to her sister, and she said something like, "My husband was just now here in the house with a group of other um, fellow members of Congress, and he had a knife, and others of them had weapons, and they said they were going to go and remove the Speaker of the House because he's a Republican, what they would have called a black Republican, meaning that he was fighting against slavery and, for the rights of Black Americans." So this was a letter in which this woman was like, a group of armed men just said they're going to march on the Capitol and take away the Speaker, kill the Speaker, remove the Speaker, do something. And the letter was her not knowing what to do. I mean, the letter was her saying to her sister, I don't know what to do now. Like, she just, and I don't know what she did, because I didn't find more correspondence, but that's another moment, right? And to the armed men in the living room of this house, they felt like, by giving the speakership to an anti-slavery Northern Republican, that it was like a slap at the South. It was like excluding the South from the nation or deeming them unimportant. So they took this as an attack on them, however just they had to reason they had to feel that. But so they felt they were being defensive. So it was self-defense. And they felt entitled to do that. In the end, they didn't do that, obviously. So we do not have the story of killing the Speaker of the House. But the fact that they were planning and thinking about it and that it seemed justified is precisely more of what we're talking about today, right? Members of Congress who were ready to attack the system, the person who runs that system in the House. That's pretty extreme. That was one of the things that surprised me about the last book I wrote, was the degree to which there were extreme moments when people were willing, particularly in the second half of the 1850s, they were willing to go to extremes along the lines of some of what we're seeing now, to hang on to power that they felt entitled to have. And they felt justified and even righteous in standing up that way. And their constituents, many of their constituents, cheered them on, right? Yeah, protect our rights. I mean, you can see the dynamic of that and how that feeds onto itself and creates a really problematic spiral with the press feeding in. We can see that happening now, and that has happened before. I just happen to know the 1850s really well because of what I just wrote. But people in the system trying to tear down the system in a democracy, yeah, it can happen. The question is then, what do you do when they're found out, right? That gets us back to accountability.
So can we build on that just a little bit? Dave A asks a really good question, which is, any connection to the South and violence, knowing how the North would react in the 1850s, which we just talked about. And he's talking about Republicans today exploiting Senate norms to thwart democracy. And so I think what he's getting at here is there a connection between what we've seen in the last 4 years in terms of particularly McConnell and others using, say, Senate rules? And so there's a big talk, like we're dealing with the fallout of that with the conversation of the filibuster is really about that, right? And so do we see that in the 1850s as well, during this time that you're talking about, the use of Senate rules or House rules, the parliamentary procedure to craft a particular kind of narrative or to subvert the will of other people, of the people?
Oh yeah. That's an easy answer.
It's a obvious yes. Yeah. But can we talk about that a little bit?
Right? I mean, very much. And there are different ways. I see Jaime mentioned the gag rule, and that's absolutely perfect. Yeah. So there are different ways in which, for sure, the rules and regulations of Congress were warped for selfish purpose, one-side purpose, to block the system and that was done in different ways. In one way, that's literally just being crafty with the rules and finding ways to obstruct. John Quincy Adams was brilliant when he went back to Congress after his presidency to the House, he was the best of all at doing things, knowing that they were not quite right, knowing that everyone would get outraged. And then there'd be like a good 15 minutes of people being outraged. And whatever he wanted to say, he could say after the outrage blew over. He was really a brilliant parliamentarian for that reason. But there were people doing it on, on not the anti-slavery side as well. So you can, and that goes back probably to the early 19th century. The early Congress, they weren't quite in the game of continual obstruction, deliberate continual obstruction in the way that it became later in the early 19th century. But then, yeah, there were there's a guy in the book I just wrote who he basically constantly was like calling points of order, asking for things to be put in the record, asking what had just been put in the record. I mean, just doing logical, appropriate things constantly and inappropriately. And every time he did that, it stopped the debate. Like every time it cut things off. And sometimes you could do that and run out the clock, and then whatever was supposed to be happening wasn't going to happen because that was the end of the session or the end of the day. So yeah, that's one way. But another way precisely is the gag rule. There's a case in which, again, people are suggesting that because the slavery issue is so fraught, and particularly anti-slavery petitions, that they shouldn't be discussed in the House. They should be tabled and not discussed. Now, the thought behind that is, well, that'll make things better, right? Because it'll be calmer. Members of Congress won't be slashing at each other. They'll be able to get business done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what happened. The opposite happened because people that gave, and this is an interesting thing to think about. It gave people, Northerners and anti-slavery people, a hook that they could grab onto that actually was not related to slavery. They could say, your rights to be represented on the floor and have your petitions be heard and considered are being violated. This isn't just about slavery. Your representative rights are being attacked. That had real power, right? That made Northerners sit up because suddenly they were like, wait, my rights? And that moved people to act in a way they might not have otherwise. So it's an interesting thing to think about. There are different ways to respond to violations of rules. One way to respond is to highlight the ways in which, people whose voices are being silenced are being denied their rights, and to announce that, on the floor with figures of authority who are smack in the middle of it. There's a power to that. So yeah, it's tried, but you can, and the gag rule was in effect for a long time, right? For a while, it was they had to reinstate it at every Congress until it went into the rule books and then ultimately was taken off. But still, that was a rule that ultimately was voted on and agreed to silence people on a key issue in the nation and to silence all of these people, massive numbers of anti-slavery petitions being just set aside, except for John Quincy Adams, who people were from other states were sending them to him, people not from Massachusetts, because they knew he's the guy who would say something. So he was getting petitions from all over the nation because they were like, oh, this guy will be able to be heard. So yeah, there are all kinds of ways. And some people would argue, I mentioned this last week when we were talking about the filibuster. Some people would argue that kind of obstruction is important for minorities because they don't have power in numbers, so they need to be able to obstruct to protect their rights. But there are limits to that, right? There should be limits to that. So on the one hand, you can say obstruction is bad, and on the other hand, you can say, well, if you're a minority who really is not being allowed to be heard, maybe it's not so bad to at least have a method that you can insist that you get heard. I don't know. This is a thing, I make these declarations about democracy, and you can take them in positive and negative directions, because that's the thing about democracy, is that it's open to opinions and thoughts. It has vulnerabilities, which is why some of the founders, like good old Hamilton, were not comfortable with like real mass democracy, because they just saw the vulnerabilities of that.
Well, we have 2 whole minutes left.
Oh no, so I didn't even realize that.
Neither did I. I was like,
wow.
I was like completely engaged in our conversation today.
Wow.
Heather asked, we don't have a ton of time, so we're gonna do this quickly, and maybe this is a topic for a future show. But Heather asks about foreign influence, and like there is talk about a lot of folks who have who've been compromised, quote unquote, or who are being unduly influenced by their relationships with um, other countries overseas. I just in the last couple of minutes, can we talk a little, sort of set the stage for that in a historical sense,
Set the
right?
stage for.
For are there historical examples where this kind of thing is also an issue, where public officials are um, subject to criticism for their engagements overseas?
Oh, okay. So before I do that, I just want to mention a point that Dave made here that's worth my stating, and then I'll flip to the question.
Yeah, great.
Insisting the minority gets heard is different from obstructing the will of the majority. And I think that's an important point. So I wanted to say that before we shift.
Yep.
What's interesting, one of the interesting things, and so now we're going back to the absolute beginning of the Republic. George Washington, when he made his farewell address, right, he stepped down after his second term, setting the precedent that presidents don't go more than 2 terms. And he wanted to give this message to the nation. And the 2 things that he highlighted as most dangerous and most destructive and most to be watched were partisanship and foreign influence. Those were the 2 things that he thought could most damage the Republic. So, foreign influence was constantly, I was just talking about this with my lecture course, that there was a constant fear that, the first real election that we had as a nation in 1796, the first one when Washington's not there, already people were worried that the French were trying to influence that election because they liked Jefferson. So yeah, foreign influence goes back. Maybe that is actually a really good point. Maybe that's even the next episode. Maybe like that couple weeks ago, we have a topic right off the cuff. It's a really good point because it has to do very much with what I was just talking about, which is the vulnerabilities of democratic government, in which you can persuade and fool and do all kinds of things to shift people's votes, to trick people into voting a certain way. And then, you allow the system to go through what it normally does because you've warped the system to your own liking. Yeah. So maybe that is worth talking about. I can go back and reread what Washington says on foreign influence and talk a little bit. Certainly in the founding, it's huge and talked about all the time. It's one of the major fears that they had.
Yeah, and it's deeply connected to what we've been talking about today. That, that, as you said, going back to what Washington said is a good way to start thinking about, or to continue the conversation about processing what's going on, because it's not just a local issue. It's there's a lot of tendrils that go out. Some of those are foreign. Some of them deal with different aspects of our social structure. Some are political, and so which you hit on really, really wonderfully today. So thank you for that.
I'll
We
say
are,
one last.
we're at 11:01. So
okay, I'll say one last thing, and then we can move on to the after party. But Scott asked, did Hamilton think any system was invulnerable? I don't know if he thought any was invulnerable, but he thought a monarchy was more stable than a republic. So sometime we can talk about fears about democracy over the course of history or something. But foreign affairs, foreign influence, that might make it to next week. Anyway, I will shut up now. I don't know, Matt, if you have something last to say before I sign off, but okay. I will say my last words here, which, as always, thank you all for coming every week for all of these weeks. I salute the loyal and wonderful group of people who come here to have this kind of discourse every week. For those of you who are new or who have never stuck around till this very end point of the show, we now segue into the after party. If you're here, if you come here online and through the link, the NCHE link, and if you're not on Facebook, you just stay right here and the after party starts when we just stop recording so that we can talk a little bit more freely and informally. If you're on Facebook, you need to join us for the after party at the National Council for History Education website through that link. So I hope some of you will stick around. Normally you do, and we're going to have, who knows what we're going to talk about today. But in the meantime, everybody have a safe, good week, and I will see you guys soon.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for a great week.